Good morning, Pete. How are you? I think at the moment, what goes on in terms of Ukraine is around support. And therefore, the big news that I saw last night with regards to your question is the fact that the UK is now guaranteeing about 500 million US dollars worth of Ukrainian debt. So that's the step that the West is taking with regards to support. I think the next thing to also ask is, how do the sanctions actually affect Russia? And so far, they are strong, but they're not going to stop them. And I think the biggest way to answer that is that in the last 48 hours alone, the UK, Europe, and the US has taken about $250 million worth of Russian gas and oil products. So, and before that, on Saturday and the weekend, it was about $350 million worth. So that is still where the finance chain is happening. The biggest support for Russia at the moment still comes from its commodities. And it's not just oil and gas. You've got things like palladium and titanium. They're one of the largest, if not the largest, with regards to palladium as a provider on the planet. So commodities are still that lifeblood for Russia with regards to finance. So yes, there's sanctions. Yes, there's restrictions, but they are more on a financial side, and Russia doesn't really worry about that. They worry about the commodity side, and they've made no indication they're going to slow down their supply. And at the moment, the West has made no indication they're going to slow down any sort of import either.
Yeah, right. Bits been made about Putin's potential reaction to these sanctions, Evan, that he'd probably just shrug his shoulders at it because he probably expected something like it. But how are the sanctions imposed on Russia by the West going to restrict really Russian finances and in particular its banks?
Yeah, so the 2014 scenario is the way to sort of look at that as a playbook. So looking at when he annexed Crimea and what happened, there were similar things. I mean, again, looking at what happened, the first one that is different is that the US has completely restricted Russia's access to financial markets from new debt. So that means that the Russian Federation can't issue new debt that is somehow denoted in US dollars or probably also in euros. The European Union is something similar, to therefore allow them to finance their underlying operations. So that's the difference. But this time around, it's the same. They're targeting medium-sized banks in Russia, so looking at targeting the military bank, looking at VEB. These are mid-sized banks. They're not touching, the Gazprom bank. They're not touching VEC, which is the big Russian state-backed bank that actually basically finances all of the government itself. So they are there. They're restricting it. It's, as I said, it feels very similar to what we saw in 2014. Yeah. They haven't really bought out anything major yet. Now, let's also put out there, if they were to step over the line in Donbass and all of a sudden take over Ukrainian control parts of it, then it would be interesting to see how the West reacts to that.
And what other sanctions in that case could be applied?
So there is always a question about whether or not you sanction Vladimir Putin's own assets. So he has assets outside of Russia. They would be the ones that they've never, ever touched. So would this be the line in the sand to finally free some of his assets? Would you then also start to ask the question, do you actually slow down on the uptake of Russian commodities? Now, again, as I just said before, we haven't seen that. It doesn't look like that would happen. But this time around, they are talking much tougher. The fact that Germany has decided to not certify Nord Stream 2 is a step we haven't seen in the past either. Now, admittedly, there isn't actually any gas going through it, and Nord Stream 1, which is right next to it, is at full capacity. But it would be interesting if that would be the next step, if they actually take some pain and actually sort of put that kind of pressure back on Russia to stop the supply of their major export that is financing most of it. That would be the biggest escalation, and that would be an interesting step if it happened.
Just a final one here, Evan. Just at the Bowser, how much higher, realistically, do you think it goes? Like, just for the ordinary punter at the Bowser, how high do you see this going?
So between 90 and 95 US dollars a barrel, the down days, so the low of the week, your Mondays through sort of Thursdays, will probably be about 185 to 190. If it goes through 100 US dollars a barrel and stays there, you're probably going to see it about 190 to 195 on the low week. That means that on the peaks, you will probably see for standard petroleum above $2 a barrel. It is very probable that you'll see that there. So the question there for what you're also asking, Pete, is that does the Australian government step in? Don't forget that the amount of taxation on petrol is rather huge. There's fuel excise, there's GST, there's all sorts of other parts to it. It's about 40% of what you pay at the Bowser has some form of taxation to it. So That could be the question. Does the Australian government actually wind back some of the taxation during this period to offset that pressure?
Interesting. They've said they're not going to do that, but if it hangs above $2 for a while, then perhaps.
So if this was to extend for 3 or 4 months, oil will average 90 to 95, even to $100 a barrel for a period of time. Inflation is already pretty expensive, and it's because of things like fuel that we're above 3.5%. So it would have to be questioned. The issue is the federal election. So May is obviously too close. They're going to have to dissolve Parliament to get that kind of change. Would be required a Parliament change, but
unlikely.
That's the question.